Good evening. Welcome to Community Technology, where we connect the global community with news, information, and resources that we hope will help improve your life. I'm Stu Reid. This is my co-host, Dave Burstein. Hey, Dave.
Hey Stu, what do we have this week?
One thing that I wanted to bring to our listeners and viewers is about privacy and geofence warrants, something that we've talked about over the last year or more. And basically, the geofence warrant is something that Google does where they capture data in a certain geographic area. And by data, I mean people's cell phone numbers, IP addresses, histories, etc., and turn it over to the cops when the cops ask for it. They often use it to round up folks that they think may be involved in some illegal activity, whether it be a demonstration, a march, or whatever. Anyway, long story short, Google is now pulling back. Historically, they have just automatically turned that data over to the police whenever they ask, without a warrant, by the way. But now Google is saying that they're only going to store the location data on users' phones, and they're going to delete it after 3 months. And even if the user decides that they want to store the information in the cloud, Google's going to encrypt it so that it won't be available to them or to law enforcement. So privacy folks are kind of applauding that as a big breakthrough. As I said, it's been abused over the last several years in many ways. Black Lives Matter folks have been surveilled and data collected on them. A lot of black and brown protest activity across the country has been the focus of these geofence warrants. So it's good to see that Google is pulling back somewhat. I'm not sure, Dave, what this 3 month thing is going to do. I don't know if that's just going to mean that the cops are going to move more quickly to request the data that they need. Uh, but I guess there's some acknowledgement that is an issue, and Google is starting to put some barriers up there to control law enforcement's access to this data.
The way it looked from the news reports on it is Google wouldn't have access itself uh, during those 3 months. That's how I read it when they said they would keep the information only on people's phones,
Hmm.
i.e., not on Google servers on where you've gone. This has been a big issue for a while. Google has incredible tracking information. You can go to Google now and ask, could you show me a map of everywhere I've been in the last 6 months?
Hmm.
And it's ready to do that. And
Wow.
it uses that to target its advertising.
Hmm.
It has no interest in doing anything else, such as becoming a foil for the American police. Most of the other big US giants that track you seem to be cooperating very freely with government surveillance in the United States. We
Hmm.
live in a surveillance state, and yes, it's probably less extensive than the Chinese, but we live in a surveillance state.
Yeah, absolutely.
Google has tried to protect people's privacy, except for their advertising purposes, for many years. Among other things, a friend of mine who was senior at Google told me they've been playing games with the feds for more than a decade. The feds are constantly trying to crack Google's system
Hmm.
to find out what Google knows about people, to get what Google knows about people. And Google has been trying to protect privacy very quietly on a very deep level.
Now, Dave,
Now,
when you say
Google,
they've been trying to crack Google's system, you mean that they've been trying to get the information
I mean the
without
NSA.
Google's consent? Is that what we're talking about?
I'm saying the NSA and its equivalents, uh, according to unofficial, off the record statements that I totally believe,
Hmm.
has been trying to hack Google constantly
Okay.
for many years.
Hmm.
That's pretty dramatic.
Yep.
Uh, it's sort of something we assume goes on, and that's what security forces do. Uh, and the NSA is just doing what the NSA does
Hmm.
so very well. They're among the best in the world. Google is among the very best in the world. Google has been trying to protect people's privacies, and that is a very complicated, expensive technical
Yeah.
operation on a very quiet level.
And Dave, let's
Uh,
just review real briefly, high level for our listeners and viewers, how Google captures this data, because everybody, most folks, not everybody, but many folks, I'd say the vast majority of folks that have a smartphone, that's got to be a huge percentage of the population. Uh, their data is available, and it's location data that is available through GPS apps. It's available. A lot of the phone apps, a lot of the apps across the board ask, "Can we record your location data?" And if you don't say no, they're recording where you are and when you're there. And there are probably dozens of apps, not just the GPS, that do this.
it's even worse than that. It's not an if you don't say no. It's buried in some fine print that when you sign up for the app, it gives them permission to follow you everywhere and track you
Mhm.
everywhere.
And when you say the
I'm
app, you're talking about most apps, are you not, Dave?
talking about hundreds of apps. I
Mm-hmm.
don't know whether it's most apps or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And then the data is sold by those apps. And most of that data has nothing whatsoever to do with your use of the app.
Mm-hmm.
That data is sold by those apps, which is how they make a lot of their money on free apps,
Right.
through data brokers and services that very freely sells to everybody, like your ex-spouse's lawyer
Mm.
or U.S. immigration services
Mm-hmm.
or bounty hunters or essentially anybody else that is willing to ignore terms of service of the data brokers, etc., that are always ignored by everybody and are
Mm-hmm.
totally meaningless.
Mm-hmm.
And the US has no interesting laws about privacy. The Europeans have gone further, although there are lots of loopholes in the Europeans, but the US has no laws. Why do you think there aren't any laws about privacy and what the companies can do with data in the United States?
I think
Stu?
that what you just said, that they're too busy making money. I think it's more about the money and the advertising and the commercial benefit than it is law enforcement, though law enforcement is certainly a very strong secondary appeal, my opinion. What do you think?
And in fact, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, etc., have lobbying outfits that make sure the law doesn't go against them, on which they spend hundreds of millions of dollars per company
Mm-hmm.
every year. The official lobbying numbers are nonsense because they define lobbying in such a way that most of it just doesn't get counted. The $100 million is my estimate based on numerous conversations and press reports on how extensive the lobbying is. It is massive. It makes you wonder whether we live in a democracy, or a
Or
country that's
corpocracy.
dominated by those with money. Uh,
Yeah.
and I mean, I'm in the middle of a lot of the stories, so I see it.
Mm-hmm.
The lobbying and the financial control in Washington is massive, and that's why there are no privacy limits. It's similarly why we have by far the most expensive drug prices in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And it would be nice if we lived up to the values of American democracy that most of us believe in, including, among other things, the heads of Google, Microsoft, and so on, when it doesn't affect their interest. And in the case of Google, often when it does have a modest effect on their interest, they have plenty of other ways to target the advertising, which is
Mm-hmm.
what they really care about there, to
But
be
Dave,
frank.
would you agree that the privacy issues are not addressed in this country primarily because of commercial reasons as opposed to law enforcement reasons. Would you say that's accurate?
I am sure they work together effectively to influence Congress.
Mm,
I've seen both.
hmm
I spent 12 years on a State Department committee on international telecommunications, so on.
hmm
The committee had all the relevant government agencies there. In fact, it was used by the agencies pretty much to talk to each other. But three-quarters of the members of that committee were the major corporations, the
hmm
Verizons and the Googles
Right.
and the aerospace, who all had Washington lobbyists who served on that committee. The committee was actually open. I wound up on it by accident
hmm
and I saw two things. One, that US policy in international communications, that means the ITU and the other regulations, was three-quarters set by what the companies wanted. And I can give you anecdotes if you want to ask me. But on anything that the security forces, which in this case usually was the DoD itself, cared about, you didn't mess with them and get anywhere on that
hmm
committee. At one point, I remember seeing some proposals we had about network regulation and so on, or network protocols and so on. And I looked at it, the proposals that we were supporting, which were being fronted by people like Cisco, and they looked like the specifications of the Great Firewall of China.
mm
And we were trying to get those into the network protocols and the operations and the international standards. The phone companies aren't very happy because they want to track everything to make sure they collect as much money as possible.
hmm
But it went beyond that, and it was really extreme. As I say, it looked like the specifications that the Chinese government would put in. So I talked, tried to talk about it. And I was quietly taken aside by somebody and saying, don't waste your time. That support, the US government is going to support that kind of control of networks, period, because that's what the people who make those decisions for the US government want to do. And I shouldn't waste my time.
hmm
And that was what I saw again and again. On anything security cared about, everybody else in the US government went along, and the
hmm
corporations happily went along unless it
mm
was
So
totally against
it
it.
sounds to me, David, that there are two big drivers of this privacy issue. One is the state, I say state, but it's really federal government security requirements, and the second is the corporate commercial requirements to monetize everybody in the country. Those seem to be the two big drivers.
In and as I say, I was actually at the State Department committee where this stuff was all going down. Whatever security wanted happened,
hmm
and 9 times out of 10, whatever the companies wanted happened. For example, I remember one case where the African nations tried to work together in order to bring down the cost of international communications, in particular, what's called transit, what you pay to connect to the internet. And the United States shot it right down at the international organizations
hmm
because we didn't want the Africans to unite to bring down what AT&T and Verizon were charging for connecting to the
mm
internet. And that was the way the world worked on almost everything except issues that became publicly known. And some of the politicians said, well, that's really an issue we have to do something about. But 9 times out of 10, it went straight to whatever the corporations asked.
hmm
And that was the way the US government works from the inside.
Now,
And I was an
have the
employee there.
Europeans been more successful in pushing back on some of this stuff?
The Europeans have much better privacy rules than we do. They're not very good. They're
hmm
loaded with loopholes. But they have some, and it sometimes makes a difference. And they have been fining the U.S. giants billions of dollars for abusing the European privacy rules.
Mm-hmm.
And but some of that is because the people who run the internet is run and controlled mostly by a handful of giant companies,
Mm-hmm.
all of which, outside of China, are American.
Mm-hmm.
So in Europe, they're trying to crack down on the abuses of privacy and other things, monopoly control, market power, because it's the Americans who have it all, and the Europeans see it as the fight against the Americans for their
Right.
control.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
The Americans then, and this is official government policy that you can read in the New York Times if you read the last paragraph of the article, is taking the attitude that any European regulations on things like privacy should be opposed because they're unfair to the American corporations,
Wow.
and that they are really trade protections, not an attempt for privacy. And that's certainly part of the European discussion
Mm-hmm.
and the issues there. It comes up in also things like net neutrality and charging for the internet.
Mm-hmm.
The European telcos are putting all the political power they have into charging Google and Facebook and so on for access to the European internet customers of Deutsche Telekom and France Telecom and so on. And they even got people at the EU who should know better to say, to heck with net neutrality. This is the Europeans making money off the Americans, and we're all for it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow.
And this stuff is not really hidden.
Mm-hmm.
This is in the press as arguments between the European regulators, who are the telecom regulators who are trying to protect net neutrality, and the EU backing the big European telcos who want to collect from the Americans.
Mm-hmm.
And none of this is secret. I may know about more about it than most people because this is my stuff and I've researched it. And I know many of the people in the middle of it. But that's the way governments work in a capitalist country.
Yeah.
The conservatives are more aware of it and regulation than the liberals. The economists talk about this as regulatory capture, saying that the corporations have so much power that the decisions of something like the FCC or the EU are usually driven by what the corporations want. And that's absolutely true.
Mm-hmm. But you're
Usually,
saying the conservatives are paying attention to that because that's something that they oppose?
I hear it most from the conservatives who say we might as well get rid of the FCC, the US regulator, because mostly it just does what the companies tell it to. And so we don't think there's any purpose whatsoever in the regulation because it's nonsense.
Mm-hmm.
And the notion of regulatory capture, which is standard discussion amongst economists, mostly came out of the conservative economists, particularly at the University of Chicago, who then use it to say, yeah, the government is worthless and useless, so we don't like government anyway. Let's get rid of the whole damn thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, when you say regulatory capture, Dave, you're talking about government being able to pull some of the strings around corporate regulation. Is that correct?
Well, the government certainly has the right to do lots of regulation. What George Stigler, Nobel Prize-winning economist, I believe is one of the primary sources on this, and I know some of the research he did because it happens my aunt was the co-author on that research, says is that all the things that the governments are doing on regulation is worthless.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't work. It's just what the corporations tell them to. And Stigl and Freedom is a classic. Friedland is my Aunt Claire, and she did most of the work on this piece of economic research. At one point, you had many states having regulations on electric rates and so on, and other states that, for whatever reason, didn't have regulations. And she looked at the different states and discovered that the electric rates were comparable in the states to regulation to the states that didn't have regulation.
Mm-hmm.
The implication being that the regulation was worthless.
Mm.
And why was it? Well, the analysis. I never talked to her about this bit, but the analysis from her colleagues at the University of Chicago. And my aunt wasn't conservative; she just was trying to do honest work. Was that the reason it was is that the regulators, which sound like a good idea to most of us, were captured by the power of the corporations,
Mm-hmm.
so that they didn't have any
Okay.
positive effect at all.
So when we say regulatory capture, the regulators are captured by the corporations. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah, and
Mm-hmm.
my argument, and the evidence on that is that generally that's true.
Yeah.
And I spent 25 years closely looking at the US regulators, the FCC, looking some at the European and other regulators and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And I came to the conclusion that even though in the US the regulators are personally honest, 9 times out of 10, they go along with the corporations.
Mm-hmm.
And the 1 time out of 10 otherwise, sometimes it's because of the courage of individual regulators, most of which, including the conservatives, are honorable human beings trying to do right by the public interest. And sometimes because it was such a big issue, like net neutrality became something that the TV comedians were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So when it becomes that prominent, that allows honest regulators to try to do their job. But when it's not a visible public interest,
Right.
it requires a great deal of courage
Mm-hmm.
for the regulators to go against the corporate interest.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And usually they decide to, as Kevin Martin, who was then the chair of the US FCC, said to me, you have to choose your battles, David. And he chose a few. He put his career on the line twice for the public interest. But we got a lot of other stories to get to.
Yeah. So I mean, we've kicked this one around, and it's not going anywhere. It's something that we've talked about in the past, and it continues to be there just because of the nature of how our capitalist world is organized. But there's some
And I
things.
continue to tilt at the windmills.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. You got to do that. So there's some other things going on in healthcare. A couple stories. Something about a new treatment for obesity. Did you take a look at
Let
that
me
story,
let
Dave?
me take that one because it's one I know very well.
Okay.
It turns out that several of the standard diabetes drugs discovered over the last 15 years, Ozempic is the best known one, not merely fight high blood sugar,
Mm-hmm.
but drives down weight. Works incredibly well. I personally have lost 100 pounds.
Mm.
And the one news story this week was Oprah Winfrey said, yes, I'm taking those medicines. There's a lot of prejudice about weight, and they help me.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the interesting story and why I wanted to pull onto this show is that funded by the company that makes Ozempic, a very large, like 7,000 person study, looked at people who were not diabetic but were overweight and took Ozempic. And they found two things. One, they lost a lot of weight. 15 to 30% of your body weight is typical
Wow.
on Ozempic and Jardiance, and literally now a half dozen other drugs that were developed for diabetes, because they affect the natural, in fact, they are simulations of the natural hormones like GLP-1, which is what Ozempic hits, that the body produces, and is apparently the main cause of obesity for most people is that the body is not producing enough of it. And that also has direct. But what the study did was looked at Ozempic on 7,000 people, half on placebo, half on Ozempic, who didn't have diabetes. Yes, they did lose weight. But the reason I brought it to the radio and is that they also had dramatically fewer heart attacks and deaths and strokes. Something like 15 or 20% fewer. This is an enormous number. Remember that cardiovascular problems, heart attacks, strokes, are the leading cause of death in the United States. They're often preventable.
But now that correlates with obesity too, though, doesn't it, Dave? So, I mean, you reduce your obesity,
absolutely,
you're going to reduce the cardiovascular risk.
Yes. And the study was trying to tease out how much of it was, it brought the weight down and that helped your heart, and how much was direct impacts. I don't think there's a clear answer on that yet, but absolutely clear. If you are heavy, taking a drug like Ozempic that brings down your weight does protect against heart attacks to a very significant extent. Now, given that they're charging $15,000 a year for this drug,
wow,
that raises some really big cases. Seems like half the people in Hollywood, those who can afford it, and probably those who can't afford it, are taking it already, and so are a whole lot of other people.
Now, have they identified any side effects to these drugs, David? Sounds like a miracle drug.
There are significant side effects, including sometimes knocking out your pancreas, but they're relatively rare. 18% of the people in this study stopped taking the drugs because of side effects. For the first 30 days in particular, you tend to be nauseous and vomit. That usually goes away. The interesting thing is a significant number of people in the placebo group who thought they might be getting the drugs also got nauseous and vomited and discontinued. Not nearly as much. It's a very real effect. And I can talk to you.
Yeah, one day we're going to have to bring an expert on, Dave, that talks about placebo. That's a subject that fascinates me, and really would like to dig into that at some point. But we've got to take a break, Dave. We're about halfway through our show here. So I don't know what are we going to talk about when we come back, Dave? I know you have a couple of AI stories you want to talk about. There's one AI story, Dave, that I did want to mention. I know we beat AI to death, but there is a story about an outfit that is using AI to quote unquote talk to the dead. It's called HereAfter AI.
They're not really talking to the
I know they're not really.
It simulates it so
simulates
well.
It simulates it. It's fascinating. Okay. This community and technology on WHCR 90.3 FM, the voice of Harlem. Stay tuned. We'll be right back after a brief musical break.
Every gal strutting with her bow through the streets covered white with snow. Happy smiles everywhere you go. It's Christmas night in Harlem. People are feeling mighty good in that good old neighborhood. Yeah, and now be it understood. Christmas night in Harlem. Oh, everyone is gonna sit up until after 3. Everyone, we be all lit up like a Christmas tree. Oh, come on now, every Jane and Joe. Greet your sweet, neat the mistletoe with the kiss and the hidey-ho. Christmas night in Harlem. Everyone is gonna sit up until after 3. Everyone be all lit up like a Christmas tree. Come on now, every Jane and Joe, greet your sweet niece to mistletoe with a kiss and a hidey-ho. Christmas night in Harlem. Oh, what a night in Harlem. Oh, come on now, every Jane and Joe, I greet your sweet niece to mistletoe with a kiss and a go, go, go.
Okay, we're back. Community Technology, Dave Burstein and Stu Reid on WHCR 90.3 FM. Want to talk a little bit, Dave, about this new, it's not new technology, but a new company using AI technology called HereAfter AI, which is using AI technology to recreate the imagery and the speech of folks who have passed away as a way for family member and friends to communicate with the dearly departed. Now, it's not magic, Dave. You're not talking to folks on the other side of the abyss, but we're using AI to recreate the folks and recreate the imagery and the language and the conversation. How does this stuff work, Dave?
I haven't tried it, but I know how it works and I know how similar things work, and it's pretty darn good.
Mm-hmm.
What we have happening with generative AI is you throw a whole lot of data on the big models like ChatGPT. It's billions and even trillions of words of data, and some fancy math goes through all that and looks for patterns and associations and what links with what. And with that, they can predict, for example, what Albert Einstein would say answering your physics questions.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, that's being done with people, with folks like Albert Einstein and Isaac Newton, going over what they actually said, feeding it into the computer, building enough of the model to be able to predict fairly accurately the way Albert Einstein would answer.
Mm-hmm.
We also, in the AI stuff, are able to now listen to voices, figure out what's the difference between the voice of Elizabeth Taylor and Liza Minnelli, say, and reproduce each voice. And they're driving some of the musicians batty because AI can say, I want a song about a love in December instead of June. The AI could write that song saying, in the style of Little Richard or James Brown. And the AI fed all the songs of Little Richard and James
Mm-hmm.
Brown,
Mm-hmm.
can take that song it wrote about love in December and give it to you in a voice that is shockingly like
Wow.
Little Richard, James Brown, or any of the current musicians.
Yeah. Dave, I wanted to cite an example in this story that is even more visceral in its impact, I think. with people, and that rather than creating songs or stories in the voice of famous folks that are departed, um, this particular person, Dr. Stephanie Lucas Oni, who is currently 75 years old, talks to her father, who is now deceased. And apparently, she conducted many hours of interviews with her father before he died in 2022. And she now goes back to him, and AI has helped kind of synthesize the conversation that she had with her dad when he was alive. And she goes back to him, and she's asking him questions like, as a black man from Harlem, how did he make his living as a police officer? How did he deal with racism? And she gets the answers back in her father's voice on her phone. She says it really is a powerful comfort to her. And she's also using it for her children and her grandchildren. So they can learn about their dad and their granddad, not from Dr. Only, but in the voice of the actual person himself. And I read that. I said, wow, that is really a powerful, powerful use of technology to keep alive the voice of conversation, the history of an individual who has passed on. I thought that was pretty profound.
It's profound, and it makes total sense that it's working. I haven't tried this particular stuff, but I understand. But this technology is being used in many ways. Let me give you a little bit more depth.
Mm-hmm.
One thing you have to understand is that the AI is not perfect. It makes a lot of mistakes. The numbers, they call them hallucinations. That's a cute word for it.
Mm-hmm.
They're just mistakes. AI gets errors somewhere between 4% and 10% of the time on things being looked at. No, I am not a filmmaker in Hollywood. And I sent you stuff that we can bring into the show. We may probably have to hold over on examples. The New York Times reporters and the New York Times op-ed talk to the AI, ask a lot of questions related to themselves, and got some incredibly accurate answers and some totally wrong. That's one thing you have to know. The second thing that isn't obvious is that the answers that this woman got from the dead went far beyond what that person had actually said. This is what AI can do, fitting patterns. If it has enough data to look at the results of basketball games or the thinking of Richard Feynman or this grandfather, it can predict with 90% plus accuracy what that person would have said on any question that's the least bit related to what they thought and said and the AI touched. This is what AI can do. It can go far beyond the data in its training, which for the big models is everything on the web,
right,
for example, and use that to predict something which it hasn't seen before, hasn't been affected, or is, for example, 200,000 structures of proteins, many of which medically important, that haven't been developed by science yet, because it can take 6 months of work, the traditional ways with X-ray crystallography and so on, to figure the structure of the protein. So most proteins, we don't know what the three-dimensional structure is going to be. And that actually was done by Google's DeepMind folks. And we now know the three-dimensional structure of 100,000 plus proteins that science had not yet discovered.
So it's actual
Proteins
medical research that AI is doing. It sounds like medical research that eventually is going to have some healing applications.
is almost guaranteed to. There's now one drug that's come out of this kind of AI stuff that's actually in second level testing in human beings. And there are literally hundreds that they're doing in animal testing and first generation human testing now. This is happening. They're doing the same thing with mineral structures, which is going to have a whole lot of effect, almost for sure, on things like how well enzymes work or solar cells. All of this is wonderful stuff. None of it is perfectly accurate, which everybody in AI knows. Most people tend to forget. And they tend to say, oh, the computer said this, it must be right.
Not.
AI is not always right. And you've got to know that. And on anything where getting it right is important. Certainly on anything in medicine, you double and triple check whatever the computer says. And in fact, the AI people were finding lots of different ways to double and triple check their own work to get more accurate and less bias, because there's a lot of bias.
Yeah. We've talked about a lot of the bias in AI in law enforcement, and misidentifying people and pulling people out of lineups totally incorrectly and accusing people of crimes when they were hundreds of thousands of miles away from a particular the scene of the crime, simply based on the AI identification of a face.
I think you mean hundreds of miles away, not hundreds of thousands
yes,
of miles.
I'm sorry.
You need a rocket ship for that.
I stand corrected.
And in fact, rocket ships are going to be rocket fuel is going to be improved by some of the techniques in AI that AI saw is essentially the best way to program an awful lot of problems. And we're talking about some of the really dramatic breakthroughs. But the important stuff may be in much less dramatic stuff. Just as being done already, a better job doing Google search. Or a better job doing Netflix recommendations for what movie you may want to watch next. All of which the AI techniques can do a very interesting and sometimes breakthrough job. There's so much hype that I'm working at a presentation how to tell the hype from the real stuff. But the real stuff is almost unbelievable. Powerful. But you also have to know what the limits are and what it can't do. And one of the things it can't do is give you 100% accurate answer. That's important. You got some more AI stories?
I saw a story where a person was interviewing the AI character, if you will, and asking the AI personality about their personality, and it was kind of fascinating, Dave. They were asking AI about Carl Jung, the psychologist, and Carl Jung had a concept that he called the shadow person or shadow personality, which is kind of like your hidden person that you don't show out to the public, but it's your kind of character inside that you hold back. It might be negative. It might be just something that you don't want to share with the world, but it's part of you that you hold back from the public. And this particular writer was talking to ChatGPT and interviewing the ChatGPT AI and asking whether or not the ChatGPT had a shadow character. And it was kind of fascinating. The conversation really sounded like a conversation, Dave. And the AI was kind of equivocating, kind of threw back some definitional stuff about what Carl Jung had talked about, and kind of ended up demurring. So, well, I'm not too sure if I have a shadow personality or not. What do you think? And to me, it was a little spooky, Dave, in that this reporter, the woman was talking to the computer as though the computer were a person, and the computer was responding back, talking about the computer's personality and who the computer was. And I know we're in the very early stages of AI, just a couple years in. But I'm just thinking fast forward as this technology evolves, where this is going to be in just, 3 to 5 years, it's going to be pretty amazing. Did you see that story? What was your reaction?
It's all pretty amazing already.
Hmm.
In general, the practical uses are just getting started.
Hmm.
So there's
Yeah.
going to be more and more. There's a reason why I've spent most of the last 8 months trying to understand it, because it's fascinating.
Hmm.
It really is the most remarkable advance in my lifetime, and there's gray in my beard.
Yeah, you're old, Dave, like me. We be old. Yeah.
Yeah. It is fabulous, fabulous stuff.
Hmm.
And despite it being probably the most important technology in my 72 years, it can't even come close to the hype that's out there, which says it's more. It's not actually that hard to understand the basic principles.
Hmm.
What you do is you take a whole lot of data, people's voices, the writings of Carl Jung, which I once had 22 volumes worth, books,
Hmm.
that book.
Hmm.
Not that I read them all, but I inherited them from my
But you had
grandfather.
them. They're on the bookshelf.
I had 22 volumes,
Hmm.
and the computer takes in those 22 volumes, collected works
Yeah, the
of art.
computer actually reads them
Well, yes,
in
although
a matter of speaking.
no, it could in reality. They've got
Hmm.
robots that will turn the pages to a device attached to the computer that can actually read the words and put them
Hmm.
into the computer. Lots of that happening. And the computer, using some very fancy math, goes through those words and say, okay, what relates to what? What does it connect to? And then can take the billions and trillions of words in something like ChatGPT and say, oh yeah, and if it connects to that, it looks like that and it goes like that, and make a 90% plus prediction on stuff that had never even been considered before,
Hmm.
much less discussed by Carl Jung. And that's real. That's happening. It is, when you're talking trillions of words, you're talking about $100 million worth of computer time and so on. But that's coming down very fast. It's coming down by half now, and then the next year it's going to come down by half again.
Hmm.
So you can do more and more. And well, if we had a few hours, I could tell you even more about it, but I don't think we have
Okay.
that much time.
No,
I'm excited.
we're just about out of time, but this is fascinating stuff, Dave. It's hard not to talk about AI every week, from week to week. So much is happening so quickly. I feel as though we're kind of getting a new perspective, a new look, some new information every time we bring the subject up.
And that's why I spend something, well, many tens of hours every week coming up to speed.
Yeah,
But let
yeah.
me go to a story that is more directly important.
Okay, we got to speed down a
Very
bit, Dave.
quickly,
We just got a minute or
the
so left.
population of the Bronx fell 6%
Whoa,
during the pandemic.
6%.
And most of that was people dying, or
Wow,
much of it was. And
wow.
not merely does it show you how important the pandemic was, which killed less than 1% of the US population, but that's 1.5 million people. But who was hit the really hardest?
Hmm.
What's the difference between the Bronx and other boroughs in New York City?
Income level, I said first.
It's mostly poor.
Hmm.
And the pandemic, partly for reasons of health, partly because of who had to go out on the subways
Yeah.
and go to their jobs in contact with others who might be spreading the virus
Mm-hmm.
because they had no choice in the matter.
Right.
Of 6% of
Wow,
the
that's a lot of
Bronx
people.
are gone, many of them because the poor people were far more likely
Yeah.
to die in COVID
Mm-hmm.
than anyone else.
Yeah.
And that's the story I would have written the show after, because that really hits home.
Yeah, it
Yeah,
does. Yeah.
I can tell you a lot about AI, but the real world has got a whole lot of other problems.
Yeah, it
too.
sure does. Okay, well, we're gonna have to end it there, Dave. This has been Community and Technology with Dave Burstein and Stu Reid on WHR 90.3 every Wednesday, 5 p.m. I'd like to wish everyone happy holidays, Merry Christmas, Happy Kwanzaa. Be safe out there and see you next week. Take care. Good night.